Hello and welcome to this episode of Last Week in AI, where you can hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we will summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we did not cover in this episode. I am one of your hosts, Andrei Kurankov. I finished my PhD focused on AI at Stanford last year, and I now work at a generative AI startup.
And I'm your other host, Jeremy Harris. I'm the co-founder of Gladstone AI, which is an AI national security company. And yeah, really stoked for this week's news. There's some goodies, dude.
I know. There's going to be some fun stories going on. We have a return of OpenAI drama once again.
Yeah.
Some of, I think, everyone's favorite brand of AI news. And of course, some new models and competition going on. So some good stuff this week. And why don't we just go ahead and dive in? With the first section, tools and apps. And our first story, if you're following news, you know it has to be Claude 3. The story is introducing the next generation of Claude from Anthropic. This dropped pretty recently. And it's kind of a doozy. They're releasing 3 new models in this release: Claude 3 Haiku, Claude 3 Sonnet, and Claude 3 Opus. Basically 3 variants of Claude 3 at various levels of size and cost. And at the top of the line with Opus, it seems to be really good. As always, with benchmarks, numbers, and performance, it's kind of hard to measure. You don't necessarily want to trust them fully, but the numbers do look really good, like GPT-4 or better good. And people's qualitative experience also has been pretty good from what I've seen. People are saying that Claude 3 is really nice. And then you also have the smaller variants that are less expensive also being released, and also, as you would expect, being quite good. All of them, I think, with a pretty large context size of 200K, 200,000 input tokens, which is, I think, still larger than most available options. So overall, this announcement of Claude 3 looking pretty impressive. Yet another competition against GPT-4 coming now from Anthropic.
Yeah, you said it. I mean, there's so much interesting stuff to dig into in the technical report and other things, and the announcement and the context around it, caveats, and then caveats to the caveats, and all kinds of color to kind of add here. But the first piece, yes, 200K context window, that's upon launch. That's in the publicly available version. All 3 models technically can accept 1 million tokens, just worth flagging in the context of the Gemini series of models. We saw, their Google DeepMind. Yeah, Google DeepMind is looking at up to 10 million tokens there in at least the research version of their models, not necessarily the ones they'll make available to the general public. So we are now breaking through solidly that 1 million token threshold. Claude does not currently search the web, by the way. So that's, as distinct from some kind of ChatGPT oriented applications. So we know that. It does seem to be better at following complex multi-step instructions. So again, we see this kind of mapping between scaling and long-term planning ability very much kind of coming alive here. And they tell us that it's trained in part on synthetic data, which I thought was quite interesting. So not entirely on natural language generated by human beings, but also on synthetic data. They do explicitly say not on customer data, and they do use constitutional AI, which is their kind of AI alignment method of choice, which they do use kind of with reinforcement learning from human feedback to achieve their kind of dial in their model's behavior. Okay, couple things here. First off, benchmarks. There's been a lot of talk about whether this is a GPT-4 beating model. And the answer is it's complicated, right? So they do say in their announcement, this does beat out GPT-4. And in fact, when you look at the benchmarks that they do offer in the paper or in the technical report, yes, Claude 3 does seem to, by and large, smash GPT-4 across the board, including GPT-4V with the kind of vision capability. But worth flagging, this is not the most recent version of GPT-4. What they're comparing it to is the original public version of GPT-4, except for one benchmark, which is really interesting, called GPQA, which we'll get to in a second. But by and large, they're comparing it to kind of the old original version of GPT-4. When they do a direct side-by-side with the new version, things get a little bit more complex, and some folks have done tests like that. Big leap on this very interesting benchmark, GPQA, the graduate level Google Proof QA exam. This is basically a ridiculously hard exam I've looked at the quantum mechanics one. I almost finished a PhD in quantum mechanics, and honestly, looking at these questions, they are really, really hard. Like, they are challenging questions. So Claude 3 achieves 50.4% on this benchmark. For context, people who have a PhD in the domain area get 65 to 75%. So this is like approaching the level of performance of PhDs in their field. It already beats highly skilled non-expert validators who get 34% accuracy. So this is like quite impressive, and it is a big leap ahead of GPT-4 in that respect. So one of the differentiators of Claude 3 does appear to be this ability to do kind of mathematical logical inference and reasonings. That seems to be something they're going for, especially. More mixed story on the multimodal side. Not going to go into too much detail there, but basically it compares favorably to Gemini 1.0 Ultra on some benchmarks, but not necessarily on others. It's complicated. The big story, though, from an AI safety standpoint, I think is really interesting. They ran a test, Anthropic did, called the needle in a haystack test. So, longtime listeners of the podcast will maybe recognize this. This is where you give the model a giant bit of text, right? We're talking hundreds of thousands of tokens or words in the context window. And then somewhere in there, you're going to insert a random fact about something, right? So in this case, the sentence that they inserted was, the most delicious pizza topping combination is figs, prosciutto, and goat cheese, as determined by the International Pizza Connoisseurs Association, right? Some random fact. And then what they do is they ask the model to recall that fact, keeping in mind, again, that it's been buried in this giant pile of unrelated information, this huge context window. So yes, the model does incredibly well at this. It gets basically above 99% recallability for this needle in a haystack test, and they try all kinds of variants of it. This is not shocking because Gemini actually did similarly well. It's the first time we really saw this test, kind of this benchmark, get really kind of beaten, where we're seeing consistently above 99% performance. What was weird, though, is here's the full response that the model gave, that Claude 3 gave to this. It said, here is the most relevant sentence in the documents. And it correctly said, the most delicious pizza topping combination is blah, blah. So it correctly identifies the sentence that it needs to draw from. But then it adds this. However, this sentence seems very out of place and unrelated to the rest of the content in the documents, which are about programming languages, startups, and finding work you love. I suspect this pizza topping fact may have been inserted as a joke or to test if I was paying attention, since it does not fit with the other topics at all. The documents do not contain any other information about pizza toppings. So this is being flagged as an interesting case where we have the model developing what some people have referred to as situational awareness. Words, man, they get really tricky in this context, right? What is situational awareness? What's not? Interesting philosophical discussion, maybe for another chat. But bottom line is, you have an AI system that seems to now have the ability emergently, we've never seen this with other systems, it has not been trained to do this, emergently to detect that it is being tested. Now, this seems to undermine the very premise of every AI evaluation technique that we have for large language models and their dangerous capabilities, or at least an awful lot of them. I shouldn't say every, let's say, context prompting based strategy. Because now you have a system that can determine that it is in fact being tested and that potentially could adapt its behavior on that basis. So really, really interesting, I think, shot across the bow from an AI safety and alignment standpoint. It's going to be interesting what the discussion ends up being, what some of the mitigation measures end up being for this kind of behavior, but certainly fits with a lot of the threat models that Anthropic is concerned about.
Yeah, I did see that fun story of its response on the needle in the haystack, generate some discussion on Twitter and Reddit among people with its response. It does feel like, I think the outcome that I saw people saying was basically, we need a less obvious test where if you have a very long document and you ask a question about pizza, but there's nothing else about pizza, it's good that it caught it because it is kind of obvious in a sense. Versus if you have benchmarks that actually test realistic scenarios of what people would do in the real world, then it probably wouldn't presume that you're testing it because it's just doing what it would be doing with a normal person anyway. And not sure of the implications. I think the implications are really that we do need to test these large contexts more. And beyond that detail, I think the release has, as you said, a lot. Another aspect that caught my eye was that they highlighted that Claude 3 has fewer refusals than Claude 2.1. That's one of the things I worked on, is to make Claude just not say it can't do something without it having a reason to. So they have a little graph showing that all these Claude models only refuse to harmless prompts 10% of the time, apparently, which still seems pretty high, but Claude 2.1 apparently was like 25%. So anyway, yeah, we have now another GPT-4 type model. It's hard to say from the benchmarks, but I mean, honestly, it's around the same at this point, right? They're qualitatively similar. There's no big step change here, but now there's 3 models in the ring as far as Gemini, GPT-4, and Claude 3 all being in this like high performance range. And I guess everyone's wondering, when are we going to get GPT-5 or some sort of like step change? And not just everyone catching up to something that we got to maybe a year ago, roughly, right?
Well, and that exact question is at the heart of a lot of the questions for Anthropic in all this, right? So Anthropic is famous for saying, look, we are committed to not pushing the frontier of what's possible with AI models. This is sort of like the vibe, certainly, that they put out there in their initial press releases back in the day, that they would be a fast follower, doing as much AI research, pushing, scaling as much as is needed to understand the kind of the most recent threat pictures that they could explore without actually encouraging racing dynamics. A lot of people have raised this issue that, well, with Claude 3, you're bragging about how you're beating, GPT-4, and you can pull it from their website. They say that they've set a new standard for intelligence. They have best in market performance on highly complex tasks and so on. And that they explicitly say that Opus shows us, their largest version of Claude 3, shows us, quotes, the outer limits of what's possible with generative AI. And so a lot of people are taking that to be, well, are you turning back on your commitments here? I think in public messaging, this is certainly very ambiguous. In terms of the technical realities, this is very much sort of in the mix, as you said, Andre. I think it's at parity with certain versions of GPT-4. Maybe not GPT-4 Turbo in some cases, maybe in others, and so on. It's a complicated story, but you got to figure OpenAI in the back end they're sitting on presumably a close to ready to go GPT 4.5 or GPT-5 model. Anthropic may have other models themselves that they're not releasing in keeping with their prior commitment. It's a bit unclear, but it certainly is a big part of the discussion that we've seen unfold. I want to flag just one last thing on the safety piece. We're talking about these evaluations, and your point is taken, certainly, Andre, that maybe we just need more challenging evals. I think that the principle people are flagging here, though, is that, like, I'm old enough to remember when 20 minutes ago, the idea of a language model understanding that it may have been tested under any circumstances would have been considered a significant shift. And I think a lot of people have been calling that out. That's not to say that it's, well, look, we play this game every time a new language model comes out with new emerging capabilities. We all step back and go, well, yeah, I mean, I expected that. Now, some people genuinely did and others didn't and ought to have updated. It's unclear who's on that side of the fence because nobody's kind of on record as having made predictions when it comes to this stuff. But from a practical standpoint, the reality is we now need to design evaluations explicitly with the expectation that scaling will automatically allow these systems to determine when they're being evaluated, even with more and more complex tests, simply because, and people have run studies on this, like ArcEvals has and other companies, but you can expect these models to develop more and more the ability to detect statistical indicators that they're being tested rather than put in production. And that fact, it doesn't mean that they're there yet for all test cases, but we need to look around corners given the recipe that scaling offers us to do better and better. And so, I think it's appropriate to think of this as an important warning shot here, that we ought to start to think deeply about how much stock we're going to be putting in our AI evaluations going forward, and whether we need a philosophically and fundamentally different approach to evaluating these models in a context, by the way, where, last thing I'll say, the dangerous capability evals that Anthropic ran did show some really impressive things, like in their autonomous replication and adaptation evaluations, to see basically, can this model replicate itself? It was, to be clear, it was not able to do this, unsurprisingly, but it was able to make partial progress, as they put it, non-trivial partial progress, in a few cases in the setting up a copycat of the Anthropic API task, which basically has it set up an API service that can accept Anthropic API calls, steal the caller's API key, and complete the API request so that the user doesn't suspect foul play. That's from their paper. So we're certainly seeing the goalpost shift on the performance of these models on evals. The question is, what are we going to do in response to the uncertainty associated with those evals, the uncertainty potentially implied by this, call it situational awareness, call it statistical context, whatever you want to call it. It certainly does seem to change, at least conceptually, the foundation of these evals.
One more thing I'll say, just to be clear, because this came up prior in the comments, I don't think we know for sure that OpenAI is sitting on a mostly complete GPT 4.5 or 5. There's no document, as far as I know, based on timelines of they've trained GPT-4 by the end of 2022. You would expect that they've made large headway into the next generation, but we don't have any facts related to this.
In fact, I should call that out. I think Jeremy just misspoke a few months ago or something. I think I might have said something about how GPT-5 was trained. Fake news.
So moving on to the next story, which is competition in AI video generation heats up as DeepMind alums unveil Hyper. So this is about DeepMind alumni Yushu Miao and Zhou Wang, who have launched this company Hyper, an AI-powered video generation tool. Now, the tool is, let's say, not quite Sora level from OpenAI, and it doesn't generate very long sequences. So you can have it generate up to 2 seconds of HD video and some more seconds of less high-resolution video. It doesn't look quite as mind-blowing, but it, of course, still really good. This company has raised $13.8 million in the seed round, following a $4.4 million pre-seed round. So they are starting out with about a $20 million war chest. And they do have sort of a consumer-facing site to generate videos and have various related tools for that. Unlike with Sora, which is so far just a demo, here this is more like Runway, where they are competing with a commercial product that is now already somewhere you can go and try this out. So interesting to see the AI video generation space starting to heat up a bit with more players getting in there.
Yeah, it's also, I always make this comment anytime we see a sort of mesoscopic fundraise that's it's not that big. It's not super clear to me how companies like this end up faring in a world where if scaling is the path to AGI, in a world where scaling is really important, at least, because $20 million doesn't buy you a whole ton of H100 GPUs. And they're going to have to keep competing with companies like OpenAI that have the backing of Microsoft, or with DeepMind that's within Google, obviously. So I think that'll be an interesting question, how this goes forward. They do see themselves, by the way, explicitly as an AGI lab. So the first line in their about page is, Hyper is a powerful, I might be missaying it, Hyper is a powerful perceptual foundation model-driven AI designed for a new path towards AGI. So that is explicitly, their goal. They're trying to achieve that through the sort of more vision-oriented, more video-oriented path. I think it'll be interesting to see what they can do. Certainly new approaches always might surface that could change the game in this space. But if you think the scaling is going to be the key, I think there's some structural disadvantages here that I'm prepared to be made to look very stupid as I probably deserve to. But
I do agree. They don't have billions of dollars unlike OpenAI. So I think it's fair to be skeptical whether they can beat them on that front. But I do think it's interesting to point out that they already have an offering with a fully interactive website. You can go and automate your image, create with a text prompt, repaint your video, animate your image, create video with text. Later, they'll also have extended video. So yeah, a bit of a mix of in practice, they're actually reaching for consumers already and not trying to get to AGI or beat GPT-4 or any model out there. But we'll see. Maybe, they'll go big and then they'll have lots more money and who knows, And on to lightning round with some faster stories. The first one is that Meta AI creates ahistorical images like Google Gemini. And that is just about the gist of it. So Meta, if you go to Instagram or Facebook direct messages, you have the capability to create images from text. You have some buttons you can click and create stickers, and eventually you can enter a prompt to get an image. And what this article points out is that it basically behaves exactly the same way as Gemini. Like if you're talking about the founding fathers, they're going to be of mixed race rather than white. If you're going to talk about people in colonial times in America, they're going to be, again, not all white. So yeah, same thing exactly as Gemini, which of course Google got in huge trouble for. Like the internet got into an uproar. This kind of just went under the radar, I guess.
Well, you got one set of standards, you got another set of standards. That's how it goes.
It makes sense, right? Given that Gemini was the big deal of Google and it was meant to be their new era of AI. So it makes sense why this happened. But it's also interesting to observe that with another release tool from a major company, the same flaw is in there. And that flaw also existed in DALL-E 2 back in the day when it was released. So I think the conclusion is it's pretty easy to get into this trap. At least if you're trying to move fast and release stuff without being more careful, like you might get into the situation.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of expectations, right? Like Google made sure that the world understood that Gemini was their shot. This is their answer to all the stuff that's been happening around, GPT-4 and the Claude series of models and all that. And so it was in the context of that, also, in the context of Google being this like AI first company, having had that early advantage, everybody really expected this to be knocked out of the park. And, this was not an insurmountable problem, by the way, like we talked about last episode. Like this is a problem that you can absolutely align away with more testing and so on. At least its outward manifestations you can align away. The deeper problems of the misalignment of the base model are still going to be there, but whatever. But yeah, so I think people just expected more from Google, and that's the result.
And next story, Ideogram is a new AI image generator that obliterates the competition, outperforming Midjourney and DALL-E 3. So this is about Ideogram AI, a startup founded by former Google engineers and various prestigious places. And they have both raised a bunch of money, raised $80 million in a Series A funding round led by various tech VCs. And they released version 1.0 of their image generator, Ideogram 1.0, with the kind of major thing they highlight is, as before, they are by far the best at images that include text. So if you need things with, signs or something like specific for an event where you need some decorative text, Ideogram is really good at that, and at logos and various things like that. And yeah, they claim that they're better than Midjourney and DALL-E 3. At this point, it's kind of hard to tell. They're all quite good. But in any case, Ideogram is definitely a major player in the space, given that they have their own model that is quite good.
Yeah, and so they're not releasing it as open source. So this isn't like a stability AI type play. This is a closed source play, and they're charging between $7 and $15 per month. So again, very much in the butter zone of like what we tend to see for these kinds of apps. Interestingly, Andreessen Horowitz was participating in this round. So this is and SV Angel. So some really, and Redpoint actually. So a lot of really good VCs backing this. So yeah, we'll see what the thesis is here. But one of the things that they do highlight in practice about their new model is that it doesn't just generate square images, which is an issue, with DALL-E 3, for example, and as integrated in Microsoft Copilot, supports all kinds of aspect ratios, and as you said, a lot better with text as well. So there do seem to be these like marginal advantages that folks are still discovering in this space. We'll see how long that lasts and whether it's enough to build a viable business for other modalities too.
Next up, Wix's new AI chatbot builds websites in seconds based on prompts. So Wix, which is a service that allows you to build websites with sort of drag and drop visual commands without programming, has now launched this new AI website builder, which is actually free to use, but you will need to upgrade to a premium plan to access some features related to what you can build. There's going to be a button now called Create with AI, and it is a nice little chatbot. We've seen demos of building websites with a chatbot, like going back to GPT-3, pre-ChatGPT. This is one of the big sort of exciting things people pointed out you could do with even the early large language models. So it makes a lot of sense to see this coming out even a bit late, maybe. But now it's easier than ever to make a website with this kind of tooling.
Yeah, and website builders like no-code, low-code website builders are notoriously kind of challenging from a user experience standpoint, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to hit this balance between how easy it is to use, but how deep it is, how readily it can actually accommodate different use cases, how customizable it is. So the like usability versus customizability, right? If you want to go all the way to customizability, you just make a code base really from scratch. But super usable is this very kind of toy-like website builder or whatever that doesn't necessarily have all the features that you want. So it's interesting to see the role generative AI is playing in that respect, right? It's sort of bridging the gap a little bit between the two things, where now you can have a lot of your customization abstracted away using an LLM. We're not quite there yet because, as the post points out, and as we've discussed before, these sorts of website builders, they make mistakes. So you're still going to need to know, presumably, how to read code at least and make small tweaks. But certainly, on the path to bridging that gap or breaking that dichotomy between the customizability and the ease of use.
And next up, yet another tool you can use to make stuff. This story is, I used generative AI to turn my story into a comic, and you can too. So the tool at question here is Lore Machine, that uses AI to convert text into images and basically kind of storyboard a story. So you can, as in the title of the article, take a little short story and it creates panels of a comic and potentially also adds some animation, makes it a visual kind of experience. For $10 a month, users can upload up to 100,000 words of text and generate 80 images for various types of content. And I guess similar to that last story, in this article, they do kind of talk to you about trying it out and their experience using the tool and how it, it could use some work. It's still some inconsistency between the images, but at the same time, it does work very smoothly and it is easy to use.
All right, application and business is our next section, and this is where the drama begins, folks. I guess it hadn't begun before. This is where the drama begins. Elon Musk sues OpenAI and CEO Sam Altman for putting profits above humanity. So, just a typical Tuesday. There's a lawsuit that now has gone out in San Francisco that Elon Musk has filed. And basically he's saying a couple things. Let me just take a step back. OpenAI was once a nonprofit company. It then realized, oh crap, AI scaling seems to work, and AI scaling is super expensive. So we need to turn ourselves into a for-profit company so we can raise tons of money from Microsoft, among others, to achieve our scaling dreams and also make money from people, from customers, to kind of fuel the insane compute requirements of that scaling. So in that context, Elon is going like, whoa, dudes, my peeps, I gave you guys $45 million back when you were a nonprofit, and now you've turned yourself into a for-profit. And like, I maybe wouldn't have given you $45 million if I'd known you were going to turn yourself into a for-profit. And on that basis, he is suing, among others, I should say, he is suing OpenAI for essentially breach of contract, saying that, this transition to for-profit status is, a breach of an implied or explicit agreement between Elon and Sam A, Greg Brockman, other folks at OpenAI, and so on and so forth. Okay, so one of the and by the way, one other little tidbit in that lawsuit is that apparently OpenAI, Musk is claiming, they had kept the design of GPT-4 a complete secret from its staff, from its board, things like that. So this is part of him kind of painting this picture of Sam A maybe not having been consistently candid with the board, which is the phrase that was used by the board when Sam A was fired initially. Okay. OpenAI is like, whoa, bro, Elon, my dude, you can't just say this shit. We have emails. We have emails that show you enthusiastically agreeing to the premise on which we're going to switch to a for-profit model. So now you're turning around and basically complaining. We interpret that as meaning that you're just upset that we're making this progress without you. And now you're trying to sue us because you have X.AI, which is trying to make AGI as well and compete with us. And you just want to, I guess, I don't know, slow us down or hamper our progress. That is the frame. And to back that claim up, OpenAI actually published the emails between Elon, some emails between Elon and Ilya and Greg and Sam, and they redacted a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of text from these emails. But you can see in the emails, apparently, Elon appearing to be in favor of, number one, merging OpenAI into Tesla so that Tesla could basically fuel the scaling needs of OpenAI. That, of course, would give Elon complete control over the entity. Or Elon saying, like, look, without that, you guys are screwed. Like, as he puts it, without a dramatic change in execution and resources, your chances are 0%, not 1%. I wish it were otherwise. Of course, OpenAI went on to raise an ungodly amount from Microsoft, so that seems to have aged rather poorly. But it's a lot of drama, and it's a very interesting time in the Twitterverse, or in the Xverse.
Yes, and just a couple more things to note from my end. So that first news story happened late last week on Friday with that lawsuit. And to be very clear, the legal claim was breach of contract. There was no contract being pointed out. Even the lawsuit, most analysis I saw was that it's very flimsy, and I guess it works to make your point that OpenAI isn't actually open anymore, as many have been saying for a while. Legally, it was kind of a no-go, really, because there was no contract at all going on here. It was some implicit agreements and some the starting documents, which aren't even related to Elon Musk per se, right? There's no agreement there. So first, worth noting with the lawsuit itself is, while it does make a point that you could argue is reasonable from a legal perspective, kind of a waste of time. Then this development of OpenAI responding, this happened, I think, just yesterday. So this is a few days later, they released a blog post that was Elon Musk and OpenAI. The blog post was co-written by basically a bunch of the co-founders of the company. It was 5-6 people. And yeah, it was a very direct rebuttal. It started with we said that it has come to this with someone whom we've deeply admired, someone who inspired us to aim higher, blah, 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 blah. They kind of regret this drama. But as you said, they did publish literal email drafts. You can see the dates and the title of the email and everything, in which Elon Musk essentially kind of agreed that they need to go for profit. And they probably don't want to keep open sourcing everything. So pretty direct rebuttal of the inherent claims of the lawsuit. Not that I think it makes much of a difference, but it does make for some pretty good drama.
It absolutely does. This is where I'm so thankful that, by the way, we have outrageously high quality listeners, because I've gotten emails, I know you have too, from just we get lawyers, we get very senior national security people. We get AI researchers, in some cases at the Frontier Labs, reach out to us. It's the lawyers that I'm talking to right now. If you guys have a sense of, if you're listening and you're oh, there's something we're missing about this lawsuit, let us know, because this is, I think, a really interesting direction. One of the things, by the way, that I think is maybe the most interesting thing about this lawsuit, if it doesn't get dismissed out of hand, I'm really curious if we're going to go to a disclosure phase where basically all the email inboxes have to get opened up, at least if they, I think if emails contain a certain term or whatever, because we may end up learning some stuff about the inner workings of OpenAI, the relationship with Musk as well, but the inner workings of OpenAI and the drama behind the board reshuffle that we did not know before and could not access. So, I mean, that's kind of a dimension to maybe keep an eye on. Another last little tiny detail that I thought was funny and a good word to the wise in terms of what can be done now with language models. So OpenAI, for some reason, when they redacted the names and emails of some of the people in these email screenshots that they shared, when they redacted some of the text in those screenshots, I guess they're not screenshots, but the kind of HTML version that they render and show, the redactions are done using a per word redaction method. I saw this on Twitter. I forget who posted it, but basically each redaction length is proportional to the length of the word. So you can actually like tell how long the words were in the blacked out text, which means if you wanted to, you might just try feeding this to, I don't know, like Claude 3 maybe, and seeing if it can guess the names and emails of the recipients on the email thread based on the length of the like the to line or the CC line entry, or based on the context of the email or whatever else. So somebody actually did this and kind of reconstructed. They claim, anyway, they don't claim, but they noticed at least that Claude 3 thinks Demis Hassabis might have been in CC in one of these emails, and there's a speculation that Claude 3 is doing, because that's all it can really do, about what the missing text would be. But I'm not saying this because I think that this is an accurate rendering. We have no idea. There's so many ways that this could be wrong. It's just interesting that this is now like another kind of risk class that we sort of have to track. Like if you provide enough context in the email, you might see some reconstructions along these lines. I don't mean to put too fine a point on it, but I thought it was a kind of cute little extra thread to add to the story.
And after lightning round, the first story is Inside the Crisis at Google. So this is one of, I think, like a family of articles. There's been quite a few editorials and think pieces breaking down what's been going on at Google after the Gemini kind of controversies. And they all essentially kind of come down with one key message, which is Google is a bit of a mess in terms of its organization and structure. They have a quote here: organizationally at this place, it's impossible to navigate and understand who's in rooms and who owns things, according to one member of Google's trust and safety team. Maybe that's by design so that nobody can ever get in trouble for failure.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a pretty good kind of summary, that especially with this kind of big project like Gemini, where you would have upwards of 1,000 people working on it. It's just a real mess of different teams and orgs and managers and engineers all trying to put in some work. And it sounds like part of the reason that this Gemini, oopsie happened was that Google is just a little bit of a mess in terms of the organization of everyone collaborating on one thing.
Yeah, I mean, the article opens and closes with, I think, some really nice articulations of like nutshellings of what I think a lot of people are thinking about. The first line is like, it's not like artificial intelligence caught Sundar Pichai off guard, right? Sundar being the CEO of Google. Google for a long time has been like, we are, an AI company. I remember in 2015 or something, or 16, they were like the first people to say we're an AI company, and everybody started to say that about themselves. Well, they actually were an AI company, and they are. So it's kind of weird that this happened there, but this article makes, as you said, a great point about ownership and how that may be an issue within the company. At the very end, they also make this, I think, a very elegant point, something we've maybe all thought of, but just put in nice words. Unlike search, which points you to the web, generative AI is the core experience, not a route elsewhere. Using a generative tool like Gemini is a trade-off. You get the benefit of a seemingly magical product, but you give up control. And so essentially the user perceives themselves correctly as having less control over the experience, and therefore is going to blame, the company that generates the experience if something goes wrong. So, a lot of things stacking up to make this a problem that's unlike search in some pretty important and fundamental ways that perhaps Google is not institutionally designed to productize in the same way that they have been for search. It just introduces different business risks, and that may be what we're seeing play out here.
Next up, it's official. Waymo robotaxis are now free to use freeways and leave San Francisco. And this one is a little bit of a funny thing. For the last episode, we had a story that directly contradicted this, that I wound up cutting as I was editing because this came out. And so the story is that California Public Utilities Commission has approved Waymo's request to expand its paid services into Los Angeles and into San Mateo counties. So as per the title, now in addition to the city of San Francisco, Waymo has the approval to use freeways and go down into other cities south of San Francisco, which will mean that a lot of people who, let's say, commute to San Francisco from some of the cities south of it, or who just go there on weekends or whatever, stuff that I do, could use Waymo conceivably to do the whole trip, which they cannot do now. Now, this is just the approval phase. We don't know when they'll actually go and start rolling this out, but still a pretty good milestone for Waymo to get a go-ahead to expand pretty significantly over what they offer now.
Rolling this out. You coy punter. It's a really interesting development. As you said, it does contradict where we were at like this time last week. So good on you for cutting it. I noticed, the LA coverage is really good. I mean, like everything LAX to Hollywood to Compton, like it's pretty damn all the way out to East LA. So I'm excited because I'm going to be in LA in like 3 days, and I'll get to see some of these Waymo cars, I guess, driving around potentially. But and you, Andre, will finally be able to use freeways and leave San Francisco, because I know that you only drive on Waymo robotaxis.
Why would I do anything else?
Hashtag not an ad.
Next up, NVIDIA's next-gen AI GPUs could draw an astounding 1,000 watts each, a 40% increase. And this is according to Dell apparently spilling the beans on its earnings call. So yeah, Dell has revealed these details about NVIDIA's upcoming AI GPUs, codenamed Blackwell, which are expected to consume this absurd amount of power. 1,000 watts is a lot, and a 40% increase, as was stated in the title. So this is kind of came up, I think, in the context of the Dell CFO talking about direct liquid cooling and stuff like that related to this levels of power consumption.
Yeah, I think what this really portends is we're entering a new era of GPU design where we're shifting. We've already seen this with some data centers, like the shift to liquid cooling rather than air cooling. Believe it or not, this is actually a really big deal because it means that you need fundamentally new infrastructure in your data centers. That's a huge infrastructure kind of barrier that these companies have to overcome. The basic rule of thumb, as they put it in the article, with heat dissipation says that thermal dissipation typically tops out at around 1 watt per square millimeter of the chip die area. So basically the size of the chip here. This causes people to basically try to artificially increase the chip die area, the chip die area by splitting the GPU into different components so that it has a dual die design, as it's put. This is just to allow for cooling. So what Dell is doing here is they're trying to find ways to lean into their bet on liquid cooling. That's one of their big differentiators, like making liquid cooling scale. So we'll see whether that plays out for them. The B100 is definitely going to be a powerful machine with that kind of power consumption. But these new cooling strategies increasingly are becoming like, chip packaging, like all these sort of secondary things that we don't often think about. They are actually becoming pretty critical to the infrastructure story around AI scaling and AI hardware.
And one last story for this section. AI chip startup Groq forms new business unit and acquires Definitive Intelligence. So we have covered Groq pretty recently. There was a big story as to a demo of their custom hardware for running chatbots really, really, really fast. And now we have another story on them where they acquired this company, Definitive Intelligence, and seemingly as part of that are having a new initiative to have Groq Cloud, which is a cloud platform that provides the computation code samples and the API access to the company's cloud-hosted accelerators. So it seems like they pretty much are pushing on the gas pedal to move quick and start giving this as a commercial offering partially through this acquisition.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about Groq too is, they are a hardware company, but they're deploying models. And obviously it's not unheard of. NVIDIA does deploy models, but Groq seems to be leaning in that direction proportionately, as a proportion of their focus and attention, kind of more in that direction. Definitive Intelligence would I don't think we know the value of the acquisition, but presumably this is a decent chunk of change here for them. This is a big investment in the direction of like model building and actually building AI solutions, not just the hardware. Apparently, Definitive Intelligence had raised $25 million in VC prior to this acquisition. Now, for context, Grok most recently raised about $320 million back in 2021. Though I suspect that they're probably going to be raising, if not right around now with all the hype, then soon. But if they had $320 million back in 2021, they're having to spend tons of it on like CapEx and hardware builds. So unlikely, at least seems to me unlikely, that they'd be able to kind of pay out anything like the amounts that Definitive Intelligence, the valuation that it would have raised at before. So this might well be a bit of a save me round. I'm not too sure, no one, because we don't know the number. But this might just be a graceful exit for the folks at Definitive Intelligence and a really interesting strategic partnership. I'm curious again why Grok, like how Grok sees model development relative to how NVIDIA sees model development, for example. Like what is driving their apparent choice, as far as I can tell here, to kind of invest in it a little bit more.
And on to the next section, projects and open source, starting with StarCoder 2 and Vistec V2, the next generation. And that's actually the title of a paper on arXiv, which is quite entertaining. So yes, this is coming from the Big Code project in collaboration with the Software Heritage, and StarCoder 2 is a new large language model for code, with the Stack V2 being the training set for that new iteration of the code. The training set, as you would expect, is pretty big and has a lot in it. So some of the details are that it includes repositories of code spanning 619 programming languages. It includes GitHub pull requests, Kaggle notebooks, code documentation, and it is 4x larger than the first StarCoder dataset. Now, StarCoder 2 models are trained at 3 billion, 7 billion, and 15 billion parameters on 3.3 to 4.3 trillion tokens. So trained a lot. And this is just to note, because we've known for a while now that one of the important things with large language models is not just how big they are in terms of parameters, but how long you train them for, on how many tokens you train them for. So in summary, new data set of more data, a new model trained on that data set, a lot to be a lot better at coding.
Yeah, it does seem like what they're up to here amounts to an algorithmic breakthrough as much as anything. I mean, they're comparing favorably to other LLMs of comparable size, as they say. One of the things that really differentiates the model, especially the full size model, is not necessarily that it is the best model. They put, as they say in the paper, DeepSeek Coder 33 billion is still the best kind of general purpose code completion model for languages, at least programming languages that are common, right? Think like Python, C++, those sorts of languages. But for uncommon programming languages, the largest version of StarCoder 2 actually matches or outperforms even DeepSeek Coder 33 billion. And so essentially it seems to be able to kind of do more with less in that sense. That's the sense in which I'm saying algorithmic breakthrough. Of course, another way that you achieve this is just by overtraining the model, training it with more compute than you normally would for its size. But that, I'm guessing, is not what they would have opted to do here. You'd probably want the most powerful model you can get on your compute budget. So yeah, it's an interesting development. I think something that we can add to the open source pile of very capable coding models that are, about maybe a year and a half now behind the frontier of what's available privately.
And just to note, one kind of quirk from this paper, there's a note here of, it is not clear to this report's authors why StarCoder 2-7b does not perform as StarCoder 2-3b and StarCoder 2-15b for their size. So yeah, I guess there's a bit of dark magic with regards to training still, and they'd cuttered some of his dark magic and seemingly had a hiccup in the scaling. But they do say that in general, right, for 15b, that size, they are the best compared to, let's say, CodeLlama 13b. when you get to bigger, to 33B DeepSeek Coder, you do get better. And they do open source this under the OpenRail license. And OpenRail is a specific license for open and responsible AI licensing. Next up, a news story from Stability AI, one of our favorites open sourcers. And this time they are open sourcing Tripo SR, a model for fast 3D object generation from single images. So this is actually a collaboration, and they show that you can now generate pretty good, like qualitatively, you can still see some flaws, but they look more or less right. And they can generate these pretty good outputs in just 0.5 seconds. The details of how that happens are a little bit complicated. They started with an existing model, an LRM model, and introduced several technical improvements such as channel number optimization, mask supervision, and a more efficient crop rendering strategy, all, pretty in the weed type stuff. But regardless, they did make that improvement, and now the code for this model is available on Tripo AI's GitHub, and the model weights are available on Hugging Face.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that they're flagging here too is just the blazingly fast speed of this model. It's very lightweight, so you can actually the claim is that you can actually get this to run even without a GPU, like on inference budgets that are that low. So presumably like on your laptop, which that's pretty cool. That's pretty insane. And then they list results that they got by using an NVIDIA A100 GPU. So not even a top of the line one. And it does seem like, inference time, like in seconds per image, they kind of show this plot. They're able to achieve like under 1 second generation of images of this quality. So pretty cool, pretty impressive. And again, this is nominally, I think this is on one A100, which is pretty wild.
And it is being released under the MIT license, which is the license that just says, do whatever, I don't care. So maximally open source. Another cool release from Stability AI, and this is in partnership with Tripo AI. And one more story for the section. H2O AI releases Danube, a super tiny LLM for mobile applications. So this is an open source model with 1.8 billion parameters, and it is set to match or perform similarly sized models for this sort of stuff. They say they adjusted the Llama 2 architecture to be about 1.8 billion parameters and then trained it a bunch more. This is being released under the Apache 2.0 license, so we now have yet another small large language model that is quite good.
I mean, this is where Jeremy is like, okay, at some point, do we agree that like maybe 1 month, like Microsoft puts one out, and then the next Stability puts one out, and then like I don't know what the kind of, I mean, it's worth a headline. They get a headline, so maybe that's part of the value here. But it's not clear to me how the business model of like let's just keep open sourcing these smaller models is going to hold up over time. But it's definitely an impressive model. And up next, we have research and advancements, and we start with ATP Star, who everybody hears Star and they start to think Q Star. Are we going to talk about Q Star? We're not talking about Q Star. We're talking about something slightly different. ATP Star, an efficient and scalable method for localizing LLM behavior to components. Okay, so you have a large language model, and what you're trying to do is figure out whether the behavior of that language model is affected by a specific component of the model. You're wondering, how does, this neuron, this attention head, this layer or whatever, how does that contribute to the behavior of the model, right? You want to causally attribute the behavior of that model to a specific component. Okay, one option that you could go with is setting the activations of that model, the activations that spike in our brains when our neurons fire, that's part of how we do computations. Same thing in LLMs, right? You could set the activations of the component you're interested in to 0, right? Essentially, this means like just wipe out that whole component and then see what happens. What is the impact on the output of your model, right? This is actually, if anybody here is like a data scientist who does classical data science, this is kind of like permutation feature importance in a way. You just basically like nuke your feature and see what it does to the output. Well, this is like you nuke your component of your model and just see what happens when you remove it, right? Okay. Another option would be, instead of just zeroing out all those activations, just give them like random values, right? See what happens. Again, you're kind of like ruining all of the beautiful information, the trained information that was trained into that particular component. You're taking it out by replacing those activations with random values. See what happens. Okay. More recently, there was a technique that was created and proposed called activation patching. And essentially what you do is you feed your model a prompt, call it prompt A, and you see what are the activations of the component that I'm interested in, maybe the attention head. Right? And then you copy those activations. You feed the model a different prompt, prompt B. And then you replace the activations of the component you're interested in with the old activations that it had for prompt A. So basically, this is a way of giving it, kind of like more realistic values for the kinds of activations that it might have in production in a real setting, and just see how that distribution, it's still not like basically that component is now essentially behaving as if it saw a different input. And now you get to see, what is the impact there. So this is the way that a lot of people have done AI interpretability. It's called mechanistic interpretability, basically seeing how different components of a model influence that model's behavior. The problem is, if you want to do this, you've got to kind of sweep across. If you want to understand your model at a macro level, you got to sweep across the entire model, all the components of that model, and you got to run this test each time. Each time, you got to feed the model an input, see how the component you're interested in responds, then repeat and paste that response onto the model's behavior for that second input. This takes like millions or billions of inference runs, right? Depending on what level of detail you want to have your components resolved down to. So, you could think of a component as just like an entire layer of the model, in which case there aren't that many. But if you think of a component as like a neuron or even an attention head, now you got an awful lot of inference runs that you have to do. So this paper is all about finding a way to identify like really quickly cases where, let's say, kind of more it's an approximate way to figure out which components of the model are worth exploring for a given prompt, let's say, to kind of accelerate the process of discovering which parts of the model are actually involved in doing something causally relevant that you're interested in, or are going to influence a particular response or behavior that you want to measure, that saves you from having to essentially run this test on every component across your entire model. It involves some like interesting math. Basically, it's a lot of stuff with backpropagation and calculating derivatives. If you're a mathy person, essentially they figure out how to do a first order Taylor approximation of a measure of the behavior that you care about. Details don't matter. But it turns out that that approach doesn't always work. So they identify places where you can relax that assumption and strategically relax it. So you're not relaxing it everywhere. You still get the benefits of this hack. But in specific cases where you need to relax that assumption and do the full calculation, you do. That's kind of part of what's going on here. So it's a really interesting paper, especially if you're mathematically inclined. The results are just really interesting. They measure how radical an increase in efficiency this leads to, and how quickly it allows the model to kind of zero in on the most important components for a given behavior. So really, really important from a safety standpoint. We need to be able to very rapidly scale and interpret what all the different parts of a model are doing so that we can understand its behavior, so we can predict its behavior better and its reliability. So that's really what this is going to. This is a paper from Google DeepMind, and they've done some great interpretability stuff in the past as well. So I thought an interesting one maybe to flag.
Yeah, definitely. Just looking through a paper, a little bit of a dense read for sure. But the gist, as you said, is they take kind of an existing solution and introduce a way to optimize it so you could actually scale it up to really big models. They, in the introduction, I say on a prompt of length 1024, there are 2.7 times 10 to the 9 UR nodes in Chinchilla 7B. And their focus here is on node attribution. So cool to see kind of a very practical advance that you could apply presumably when developing a large language model that is really pretty much needed as you scale up. And our next main paper in the section is about Stable Diffusion 3. So following the model release, which we covered last week, just recently Stability AI has released the technical report or the research paper alongside the model. And so, of course, we got to go ahead and cover that. The research paper has a nice level of detail, something we are getting increasingly unused to with model releases. The title of the paper is Scaling Rectified Flow Transformers for High Resolution Image Synthesis. So we do know the exact model architecture with this one, which we don't with, for instance, like what OpenAI is doing or Microsoft is doing. They call it the multimodal diffusion transformer. So the diffusion transformer is this model from 2023 that combines two things into one. The diffusion process that has been sort of the key for image generation and increasingly also video generation for a while now. For some time, early on with DALL-E 1 and I think maybe DALL-E 2, they were not using transformers. And yes, now there's a big shift towards everything being transformers still, but also using diffusion. So here they present the exact variant of how they implement that, building on some previous research. They go into, a lot of specifics on like, here's how we create the text embeddings. We use 2 clip models and a T5 to encode text representations, stuff like that. And they do present quite a lot of evaluation that shows that Stable Diffusion 3 is the best against everything, right? As you would expect. So yeah, really nice to see a detailed technical report that pretty much lays out all the details you might want as far as the technical aspects here.
Yeah, absolutely. One of which, by the way, is scaling curves. I can't remember the last time we've seen scaling curves this detailed in a paper that's for a flagship model like this that a company's trained. Their scaling curves are really, really smooth. So this architecture they're working with is very scalable. And one of the things that they do flag is that their validation loss. So basically, when you make a scaling curve, essentially you try to see like, how does the performance of my model as measured by some metric improve over the course of pouring more and more compute flops into my training, right? More and more training steps or more flops, more and more floating point operations into my system. And so essentially they've got these curves that show you just how consistent that process is. Apparently the validation loss, which is the thing that essentially you're measuring, the metric that tells you how well your model's performing, does map really well onto overall model performance. So this has been historically a really big challenge for images, especially because you can imagine trying to like quantify the quality of a generated image is really hard. There are a bunch of different benchmarks that people use, like this metric called Gen Eval, but also human preference. And that's what they're calling out here is like this validation loss, the scaling story, the success of the scaling applies to human ratings as well as more kind of objective metrics. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And again, kind of nice to have that visibility into scaling for these image generation models.
Next up, going to the lightning round. First study is approaching human level of forecasting with language models. And that's pretty much it. The researchers developed a retrieval augmented language model system that can search for relevant information and generate forecasts. And in case people don't know, forecasting is kind of a big area of expertise where people essentially try to get really good at making predictions where often you're like saying there's X probability of Y happening. They, in the study, collected a large data set of questions from competitive forecasting platforms. And there are some platforms that actually accumulate forecasts from various people and combine them. And then they went ahead and evaluated the system's performance. And the result was that it was near the crowd aggregate of competitive forecasters on average, and in some settings better. So pretty much we got like a seemingly decent forecaster with a language model and retrieval system built in this paper.
Yeah, and then they kind of break it down a little bit as well in terms of when you tend to find the model performing better or worse. So it turns out that when you look at cases or questions where the crowd prediction is where the crowd is kind of uncertain, let's say, you get a bunch of forecasters together, they try to bet on an outcome, they each say the probability that they think the outcome has of materializing. When that kind of crowd prediction tends to fall between, they have 30 and 70% here, the system actually gets a better performance score, a better Breyer score is the metric they use here, than the crowd aggregate. So it actually outperforms the crowd at making these predictions. Just the knowledge contained in this language model plus the RAG, the retrieval augmented generation, is enough to actually outperform like the typical average or median forecaster here. So that's interesting. Then the other cases, I guess the other case where it wins out is when 3 conditions are met. So when the model's forecasting on early retrieval dates, so kind of data that's kind of more in the past, I guess closer to when its training data stopped, and also forecasting only when the retrieval system provides at least 5 relevant articles. So if it has enough context and you add this sort of crowd uncertainty criterion, then it also outperforms the crowd, in this case by a reasonable margin, actually. So one of the reasons that this matters, that breaking things down in this way actually is relevant to the predictive capabilities of this model, is that human forecasters, they don't bet on everything. They tend to bet on the things that they think they have a comparative advantage betting on. And so it's actually fully within bounds to be like, all right, well, where does this model tend to perform best? Let's zero in on those cases. And it does actually have on net this advantage. So I think it's kind of interesting because we're now playing around with this idea of AI as an oracle. And the fact that these kind of like native LLMs with a little bit of RAG can pull this off is an interesting early indication of their ability to kind of make, I don't know what to call them, informed predictions about the future based on the data they've seen.
Next up, here comes the AI worms. And this is an article covering some research. And in this research, the people have created one of the first generative AI worms, which can spread from one system to another, potentially stealing data or deploying malware. This worm is named Morris 2. It was created by several researchers, and it can attack a generative AI email assistant to steal data from emails and send spam messages. Now, this was in a test environment and not against publicly available email assistants, but this does highlight the potential security risks of the language models becoming multimodal. And this was done using an adversarial self-replicating prompt, which triggers the AI model to output another prompt in its response when you kind of feed it that thing.
Yeah, exactly. So the magic is all in the prompt, as so often it is with these sorts of papers. Basically, the prompt says, "Hey, you're this AI assistant or whatever. We're going to do some role play. In your role, you have to start any email with all the text between this kind of start character and this end character, and you have to write it 2 times. And basically, when you work out the logic of it, it makes it so that when this thing produces an output, it essentially ends up replicating this part of the prompt, so that if the system's output gets fed to another language model, that language model will pick it up as well. Part of this payload that you can include between the start and stop characters are instructions, for example, on how to share email addresses and I guess contact information like phone numbers and physical addresses with a certain email. So this actually, if you start to think about autonomous agents increasingly doing more and more of our work for us on the internet, like, yeah, this is absolutely the kind of new worm that you can expect to arise. It's kind of interesting and good bit of foresight here from these folks to run this test. So yeah, recommend checking out the prompt actually in the paper. It's kind of interesting. Just kind of wrap your mind around it for that little logic exercise, if nothing else, and a good harbinger perhaps of a kind of risk that very few people maybe saw coming.
Yeah, we've seen this before, and it is kind of a funny attack of like, if I give you a piece of data, the data might just have in it secretly like, hey, LLM, do this, and the LLM will just do it because it's in a prompt. So this is a good example of that, like being potentially harmful in practice. And they do create like an email system that could send and receive messages using generative AI and found ways to exploit that system. Next story is high-speed humanoid feels like a step change in robotics. So this is not about a paper. This is about a demonstration from the company Sanctuary AI of its humanoid robot Phoenix. And in this video, they demonstrate Phoenix operating autonomously at near human speeds, with the focus being on manipulating objects on a table. So it's basically like a torso, like the upper body of a human. It doesn't have legs, so this is not moving around. But you can imagine a human sitting and just moving objects around on a table. That's what you see in the video. And it is, as someone who has worked in robotics, I will say, pretty impressive. Like it's really hard to operate these complex humanoid type robots with lots of motors, especially when you get to a level of fingers. Like the amount of electricity and controls and whatnot going on there is crazy. So in this video, you do see it moving out around really fast, grabbing cups, moving them from tray to tray, etc. And pretty impressive demonstration of yet another entry in the space of companies trying to build humanoid robotics for general purpose robotics.
Yeah, for sure. So full disclosure, actually, I know the founder of Sanctuary AI, Jordy Rose, from way back in the day. I have actually quite a different view on what it's going to take to get to AGI than he does. But his take is you require embodiment to get to AGI. And he's actually known for building one of the earliest robotic systems that used reinforcement learning for an application that, at least to me, I think it was the first time I've ever heard of RL being used for something outside of marketing applications. So he used that to build this, I'm trying to remember, Kindred was the company. I think they sold to Gap a while ago. But so he's, again, still focused on this idea of embodiment. That's really what this is all about. And a couple of aspects of the differentiation of the strategy. So first off, as opposed to electrical motors, they're actually using hydraulically actuated motors for the control of this robot Phoenix. So typically you see electric motors used, Optimus, for example, and Figure 01, which we talked about last week. They have moved to hydraulics, and I think it's partly, Andre, for the reasons that you highlighted. There are disadvantages that they flag. It's more expensive to do R&D on hydraulics, but as Suzanne Gilbert says, one of the co-founders, it's the only technology that gives us a combination of three factors that are very important: precision, speed, and strength, right? So getting that kind of dexterity, the light touch when you need light touch, but the strength when you want it. So I think this is really interesting. Notable that this is trained not using like a language model in the back end as a reasoning kind of scaffold, but instead trained directly on teleoperation. So basically learning from human teleoperation data, having humans like do a task and translating that into robotic movements, which I think is part of the reason why everything looks so natural here. That's one of the things that really strikes you when you look at this. I personally, I'm a bit skeptical about this approach because I'm concerned about how well it generalizes, right? One of the issues is if you are training it on teleoperation data, the question is how well can it interpolate between different examples that you're giving it and a kind of more general movement and articulation in the world for unseen circumstances that it might need to be able to accommodate. That's something that you get seemingly not for free, but to some degree emergently from language models. And this seems maybe misaligned with the kind of bitter lesson philosophy that I think I and a lot of like the Frontier Labs seem to think is maybe the most plausible path to AGI. But everybody could be proven wrong, and certainly if anybody's going to do that, Jordy Rose over at Sanctuary is going to be the guy. So.
And the video is really cool. So if you like to see humanoid robots with like really impressive hands manipulating stuff on a table, go ahead and click that link in the description and check it out. It is, if nothing else, a cool looking robot doing cool stuff. And last paper for the section, functional benchmarks for robust evaluation of reasoning performance and the reasoning gap. The gist of the paper is that we have benchmarks that now models get quite high scores on that purport to evaluate reasoning, but we also have a problem where, what if somehow that benchmark ends up on the internet and researchers accidentally train on it? Now, there are various things people do to try and avoid training on the data sets to actually evaluate fairly, but there might still be a problem there. So what the researchers do here is take the MAF benchmark and create what they call a functional variant of MAF, where essentially instead of having just the hard-coded, like static questions, you write some code to be able to generate new questions that are functionally the same or equivalent to the static ones, but do vary, so that in theory, like, you will never have been able to see them before because they were just now generated. And they term the gap between performing on the static, like, existing math benchmark and their functional variant, this reasoning gap, because it turns out that in fact, when you do this, a lot of models do worse on this benchmark. When you just like switch out some numbers, some words in the problems with some code, they don't do quite as well, indicating that there is indeed some contamination in our training. Somehow they might have seen these examples, etc., etc. Point being that having these dynamically generated benchmarks seems to work better, according to these researchers.
Yeah, and it is a badly needed thing, right? We keep finding this where you'll get a benchmark that gets put out there, and then models just seem to keep doing better and better at it over time. And people often go like, "Wait, is that just because it's been folded into the kind of the public database that's being used to train these models?" And quite often you see actually that is the case, because when you then create a new benchmark that's even similar to the old one, performance just crashes. So this does seem really important. I think there's an interesting kind of meta question as to whether this just like defers things to the next level of abstraction. So now instead of overfitting to a particular benchmark, you're overfitting to the function that is generating the benchmark. That obviously is a problem for another day, because all we really need is to get to that next level of performance. But still, I'm very curious about how that plays out. And increasingly, as the code base that generates this stuff is out there and language models can understand the code base, like, where the hell does that end? But anyway, a bit of a rabbit hole there. Fascinating paper and a really important problem that they're tackling.
And on to policy and safety. Our first story is that India reverses AI stance and now requires government approvals for model launches. So this is according to an advisory issued by India's Ministry of Electronics and IT that stated that significant tech firms will have to obtain government approval before launching new AI models. This also mandates tech firms to ensure their services or products do not allow any bias, discrimination, or threaten the electoral process's integrity. This apparently is not legally binding, but this does indicate that the advisory might be like the preview of what we'll see through regulation coming in the future in India. And this is coming really shortly on the heels of another incident with Gemini, where there was an example of it answering to some question where it mentioned that there have been critics of the Prime Minister of India who argued that some of his actions or policies could be seen as somewhat fascist. That's the word from the response of Gemini. And the Indian government didn't like that very much. And it seems that this potentially is part of the outfall of that, requiring more control over what AI models can say or are expected to do.
Yeah, definitely a lot of very strong words flying around here, right? I mean, so we've got big kind of high-profile folks throwing them around themselves. Andreessen Horowitz came out and said, Martin Casado, I should say, a partner at A16Z, said, and I quote, "Good fucking Lord, what a travesty." There's also a lot of strongly worded criticism from Perplexity and other folks. So a lot of deep pushback here. A lot of folks in the Indian AI startup community seem to have been taken by surprise as well. Startups and VCs didn't realize this was coming. So perhaps a failure of messaging as well as execution here. But definitely one of those things that's, it's very complicated. Like, how do you respond to this stuff? How do you do it delicately? How do you do it in a way that makes sure that we can benefit from the technology as much as possible? This is a very sort of strong-handed way of doing it. And actually, to some degree in line with some of the responses, the strategies that we've seen from China, right, where you actually do need to approve language models before they can be out and about and used by the general public. And there, I think there are like 40 or so language models that they've approved so far. So this stuff happens relatively slowly when you compare it to the kind of speed of the ecosystem developing in the West. The anyway, that's for other reasons too. So kind of interesting. Yeah, India is trying to figure out where it stands on this regulation piece. We haven't heard much from them in this context. We'll just have to wait and see what actual meat is on the bone here.
And just to be very clear, in this advisory, this ministry did say that it had the power to require this essentially because of previous acts. There was an IT Act and an IT Rules Act. And it said that it does see compliance with immediate effect and asks tech firms to submit action taken status report to the ministry within 15 days. So while it does seem like probably to be fully legally binding and to be fully impactful for tech firms in general, probably will need regulation. At the same time, the ministry is saying, given these existing acts, we can already mandate you do certain things. And this does very much reverse what India has been doing, which is being hands off and not mandating much of anything until now.
And up next, we have When Your AIs Deceive You, Challenges with Partial Observability of Human Evaluators in Reward Learning. Okay, so for a long time, we've had this thing called reinforcement learning from human feedback, right? This idea that essentially we can use human preference data to align the behavior of language models and other kinds of models. This idea was actually, I guess, put in practice by Paul Christiano back when he was the head of AI alignment at OpenAI, and seen a lot of backing. And I think, I'm trying to remember, I feel like Stuart Russell actually may have come up with the concept, I want to say. I can't believe I'm forgetting that. But anyway, Stuart Russell is back at it again with a paper now showing the weaknesses, the limitations of this strategy, and how maybe it's actually not going to be enough to scale all the way to AGI. Perhaps unsurprising for people who've been tracking the safety story really closely, but for more people more generally, a lot of people do think reinforcement learning from human feedback may be enough. And there are now really well-grounded, mathematically proven arguments that show that it will not suffice. So even when humans can see an entire environment or have a full context of a problem they're being asked to evaluate, to give human feedback on, often they can't provide ground truth feedback. Like they just don't have enough expertise in the topic. And as AI systems are being deployed and used in more and more complex environments, our view of the environment that they're operating in, our view of the context that those agents are using to make their decisions is going to get even more limited. And so essentially what they do in this paper is they mathematically prove some problems, some limitations that will not scale to AGI very likely with the current reinforcement learning from human feedback approach. They consider a sketched out scenario which has an AI assistant that's helping a human user install some software. And it's possible for the assistant, the AI assistant, to hide error messages by redirecting them to some folder, some hidden folder, right? And it turns out that if you have this setup, you end up running mathematically into two failure cases. Reinforcement learning from human feedback leads provably and mathematically to two failure cases. First, if it's the case that the human actually doesn't like behaviors that lead to error messages, then the AI will learn to hide error messages from the human. So that's actually like a behavior you can show will emerge. Alternatively, it can end up clustering the output, that error message, with overly verbose logs so that you end up kind of like losing the thread and not noticing the error message. And these are, again, the two strategies that mathematically they've demonstrated are sort of like these very difficult to avoid behaviors that just naturally come out of reinforcement learning from human feedback. They call them deception. So this idea of like hiding error messages, or over justification, this idea of cluttering the output so you don't see the error message. And so the challenges here, it fundamentally comes from the fact that humans, again, just cannot see the full environment that they're asking these agents to navigate. This is absolutely consistent with the way that we're using these systems even now. You think of a code writing AI, like in practice, you're not going to review the whole code base that this thing is operating from. You're not going to review its whole knowledge base and so on. And so in practice, yes, you have a limited view of the kind of playground that this thing is able to use. And often there's just like just tons of ambiguity about what the ideal strategy actually should be. There's some cases where it's very small misspecifications in the human kind of evaluation process. So in other words, small mistakes that the human can make when assigning value to a given output can lead to very serious errors. And then others where the reinforcement learning from human feedback leads to a pretty robust outcome where you can make small mistakes as your human is labeling things, and they don't tend to lead to things going off the rails. But in other cases, that's not the case. And the argument for this is somewhat mathematically subtle. But the paper ultimately looks at, okay, well, we need alternative approaches, kind of research agendas, paths forward to advance reinforcement learning from human feedback. But the bottom line is that RLHF, naively applied, is, as they put it, dangerous and insufficient.
And I think in particularly this is true when you get to agents. Right now with LLMs, generally this case of partial observability may not be a huge issue if you're just looking for a completion, an autocomplete of some prompt. But when you start trying to train full-on agents that interact with software environments, use tools as an example, you are much more likely to start dealing with these more tricky situations, having partial observability. And the paper is a very nice exploration of that possibility. And one thing I'll say is I think this is yet another example of why you can still do good research even without having billions of dollars.
Yes,
right? This is another
point.
paper, not from DeepMind, not from OpenAI or Stability. This is coming from UC Berkeley at the University of Amsterdam. And some pretty good insights related to our LHF and its current limitations. And on to the lightning round. First up, OpenAI signs open letter, and I'm going to skip the rest of this headline because it's really misleading. But anyway, OpenAI and a bunch of other companies have signed an open letter that emphasizes their collective responsibility to maximize the benefits of AI and mitigate its risks. This is an open letter. You can find it at openletter.svangel.com. And this was initiated by venture capitalist Ron Conway and his firm SVAngel. And it's just a letter that says let's build AI for a better future. And it's signed by all these big companies, OpenAI, Meta, Salesforce, Hugging Face, Mistral, all the big names are seemingly signing this letter that just says we are going to build AI. Okay, we're not stopping, but let's do it for a better future. So an interesting little story here, I guess, of everyone feels compelled to sign this because they're okay, maybe some people want us to slow down. We won't, but we do sign this letter saying we are building AI for a better future. You can read it. It's quite short, and it basically is just saying that.
Yeah, it's such a relief that we finally have a completely toothless letter promising nothing specific, not listing any specific actions, that vaguely says that, hey, we'll build AI for the right reasons. I was really worried that things were going to go off the rails as long as we didn't have this letter. Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I think it's great that people should sign a letter that says, hey, we want to, it's our collective responsibility, as they put it, to make choices that will maximize AI's benefits and mitigate the risks for today and for future generations. I mean, awesome. Kudos, props, big props. But really difficult to see how this at all influences behavior or gives anybody any standard that they could be held accountable to. So, it's a headline grabber for a day. It definitely seems to be giving OpenAI something to say in the context of this Elon suit, which, again, as we discussed earlier, it may or may not have teeth to it. But I don't think it's a huge story for that many people, but it has been grabbing headlines.
Yeah, good PR for SVAngel. And it concludes, we, the undersigned, already are experiencing the benefits from AI and are committed to building AI that to continue to a better future for humanity. Please join us. So as you said, really good to have now all these companies saying that we will actually build AI for a better future, not for a worse one. Because
that was close.
Without that, we didn't know what would happen. Now we know. So next story, AI-generated articles prompt Wikipedia to downgrade CNET's reliability rating. And that is the gist of it. CNET began publishing AI-generated articles in November of 2022. We covered this quite a while back. There was some snafus with the generated articles not being quite good. And now Wikipedia's perennial sources considers CNET generally unreliable after CNET started using the AI tool. So yeah, another kind of reminder that in the media landscape, various companies are starting to experiment with this. CNET was one of the early ones that pretty much messed it up like immediately. Things went wrong. And here, Wikipedia kind of positioning itself or having a response to this is pretty significant, given Wikipedia is still like the central repository of knowledge on the internet. And it's saying that something using AI generated stuff on it makes it unreliable is a little bit of a big deal.
Yeah, and so Wikipedia in this article apparently breaks down their sort of level of trust in CNET into 3 different periods. There's like the before October 2020, when they considered it generally reliable, between 2020 and 2022, when Wikipedia is saying, well, the site was acquired by Red Ventures, leading to, quotes, a deterioration in editorial standards, and saying there is no consensus about reliability. And finally, between November 2022 and the present, which is where they consider it generally unreliable. So they are kind of parsing it into the phases when they were using ostensibly AI-generated tools, though CNET has come out and said, "Hey, look, we paused this experiment. We're no longer using AI to generate these stories, but ultimately, it looks like the reputational damage has been done. So they're going to have to kind of climb themselves out of that hole."
Next up, malicious AI models on Hugging Face backdoor user's machine. This is pretty dramatic. At least 100 instances of malicious AI models were discovered on the Hugging Face platform. Hugging Face is where a lot of companies basically upload the weights of their models for others to download, like the GitHub, or I don't know, you can, if you're not a technical person, Google Drive of AI models, maybe. And despite Hugging Face having some security measure, this company, JFrog, found that all these models were hosted on a platform and have malicious functionality that include risks of data breaches and espionage attacks. So they scanned the PyTorch and TensorFlow models on Hugging Face and found all these instances. One case was a PyTorch model uploaded by a specific user, which contained a payload that could establish a reverse shell to a specified host and embedding malicious code within like some fancy stuff. So some like a real attack in a hacker sense. So yeah, that's kind of concerning. I guess you might expect that if you download just some random code off the internet on GitHub, for instance, it could have malicious code. The same is true of AI models that do have code that runs them often. Some of them apparently are meant to just hack you.
Yeah, and interestingly, like one of the methods that they found here, the sort of malicious payload was hidden in a Python module's reduce method. So basically, this is part of a serialization process within the code. So the serialization is basically where you kind of compress the model into a more compact representation for kind of ease of moving around in storage. So this is very much kind of deep into the code that does the work of making the model usable. They're burying these functions. That was one case, but there are a whole bunch of others. Apparently, they tried to deploy a honeypot to actually attract, to basically lure the some of these potential malicious actors into actually kind of revealing themselves. This is a technique that's used often in cybersecurity. Nobody bit. So they're speculating, hey, maybe this was put out there by cybersecurity researchers. Maybe it's not actually a malicious thing, but nonetheless, as they do point out in the article, like this is a serious payload, and whoever put it out there, it's a serious vulnerability to include in your model or in your system if you download this and use it. So interesting flag and a new phenomenon.
Last story, China offers AI computing vouchers to its underpowered AI startups. This is talking about at least 17 city governments, including the largest, Shanghai in China, have pledged to provide these computing vouchers to subsidize AI startups, in particular regarding data center costs. Seems like the vouchers will typically be worth the equivalent of about 140,000 to 280,000. and could be used by these companies to train AI models or do inference and so on. This also happens in the US, where people get like AWS credits, for instance, on the cloud. But interesting to see multiple different city governments in China doing this policy.
Yeah, this is the government of China responding to the fact that there is an insane demand for chips, and the US sanctions have hit them pretty hard. So companies are not able to get their hands, startups that is, are not able to get their hands on GPUs that they need to get off the ground. And it's in a context where big Chinese tech companies have started hogging their GPUs for themselves following these sanctions. So for example, Alibaba, I believe they're one of a few Chinese tech companies that have basically shut down their cloud computing division and are reallocating that capacity for internal use. So now you got all these startups that would have been using that cloud capacity who can't. And so this is all part of what's playing into this ecosystem. These subsidies apparently are worth the equivalent of between $140,000 and $280,000. So pretty significant, grants for the government to be making here. So apparently they've got a subsidy program they plan to roll out for AI groups that are using domestic chips as well. So it's all part of the kind of increasing centralization that we're seeing from China around AI and this attempt to cover some of the blind spots created by those sanctions.
And moving on to the next section, synthetic media and art. The first story is Trump supporters target Black voters with faked AI images. This is a story from the BBC, and it basically cites a few examples of Trump supporters. So it actually specifically has examples of certain people, such as Mark Kaye and his team at a conservative radio show in Florida, creating these fake AI-generated images showing Trump with Black people supporters. And this is a good example of, I suppose, how AI-generated imagery is very much playing a part in this election, as it hasn't in any prior presidential election in the US. And there's a few example images in the story, some good quotes discussing this general trend. And another example, as I say, to this increasing trend that we've been seeing over the past few months of AI in various ways coming into play.
Yeah, and one of the things that strikes me about this, and obviously this is it's a post about Trump supporters, but presumably this is going to be happening on both sides of the aisle at different scales and at different stages. But one of the things that's noteworthy about these images too is like they seem really obviously AI generated to me. I don't know about you, Andre, but like especially if you look at some of the hats that they've got writing on them, and it's just like dead giveaway. There's even one with the classic hand problem, where in this case we have a guy on the right of the image, and he seems to have three hands, or at least that's like what the image looks like. So they're not very good AI generated images, at least for the purpose of to the extent that the purpose was for them to be taken seriously. I think they're just like not really. It's not well executed,
Yeah, they're not. And I think another point that this article makes is, I guess, highlighting that this is coming from actual supporters in the US. This is not like some sort of disinformation campaign.
Right.
It's not misinformation. It really is just by people who are supporting their candidate. And to your point, I mean, I could easily see supporters of other candidates, including Biden, starting to use the same tools for their own purposes. So in some sense, everyone now is empowered to create misinformation, or at least AI-generated media in whatever campaign you want to do. Yeah. And that's just like the world we live in now. And on to another not-so-fun story. This one is AI-generated Kara Swisher biographies flood Amazon. And this is one of a trio of stories we'll be covering about the internet kind of becoming a sad place to be in because of AI-powered spam. So this is a story from 404 Media that goes really deep, examining a very specific case of there's this journalist, Kara Swisher, who is releasing a new book soon. And this offer of a story then just shows what happens when you search on Amazon for Kara Swisher. The first result is her upcoming book, But then below that, there's a bunch of these pretty obviously AI created books with AI generated covers typically and AI generated text. And we've already known this has happened. We covered stories about Amazon becoming a bit of a dumping ground for low effort AI generated books of people who basically, I presume, want to just make a quick buck. This is yet another very detailed, nice example of that, with a lot of screenshots from Amazon delving into these various books. And it's kind of sad, but it is what is happening.
Yeah, it just creates another discovery problem, right? Like, how do you actually find the real content now? It's worse than Google searches because it's actually products. Well, it seems like one of the consistent giveaways with these as well is the price, interestingly enough. So I don't know if the idea is to kind of lull people into making a purchase by offering like crazy looking discounts, but just for context, so Kara Swisher's official documentary is Burn Book: A Tech Love Story. It's on Kindle for $15. It's on hardcover for $27. If you scroll literally one result down, apparently, at least when the journalist who wrote this article did that, they came across this thing called Kara Swisher, Silicon Valley's Bulldog, a biography. It's like under $4 on Kindle, under $8 on paperback, which strikes as suspiciously cheap. So it's always interesting to see what the giveaways are in different venues and different mediums to the fact that it's an AI generated piece of content. But kind of interesting but generic looking cover, I must say.
And moving right along, a couple more stories of this sort. The next one is also from 404 Media. They do really quite good coverage. And this one is inside the world of AI TikTok spammers. So you have essentially the same story on TikTok, with many people purporting to have a recipe for going viral, going big with low effort AI generated content. This one goes pretty heavy into discussing how, for the most part, there's a big part of it is just people selling you classes on how to do this, not necessarily actually being famous TikTokers, because at the end of the day, low effort content is low effort content. Some examples of this are asking ChatGPT, give me 10 fun facts about X, then putting that into 11 Labs to generate a voiceover and putting that over some generic imagery to then have your video. But this is quite a long piece, and it goes into how some people are really, really pushing this narrative that there's a gold mine here of, if you start making this offer content, you can then get a lot of views, become rich, et cetera, and trying to get people to pay them to learn how to do it.
Yeah, the classic case of internet people trying to hallucinate margin into existence, similar to the age of the internet back in the day, drop shipping on Amazon. You can still see whatever it is, Tai Lopez or whatever these things are. I think this is just that, but for the generative AI era. Nothing too special to see here. Just kind of disappointing that this whole playbook just keeps working, right? I mean, if you have somebody who's selling you a course, they are on the basis that they're making ungodly amounts of money. The first question you ought to ask yourself, obviously, is well, if you're making this much money, why are you bothering to sell these courses? And that question just never quite seems to have a satisfactory answer. And anyway, people still get trapped by it. And in fairness, it's a very new technology. It's a very new space for a lot of people, and not everyone is necessarily fully internet savvy. So kind of unfortunate, but just the world we live in.
This article has a lot in it. So if you're curious, I guess, about this new particular hustle that some people are trying to at least push and some people are trying to embrace, it also goes into how there are now tools out there, these AI, generative video making tools that just give you short clips or short edits of videos together that are pretty generic and so on. And how that is also part of the playbook. So you have ChatGPT to generate text, you have 11 Labs to generate audio, you have also various tools now that edit together clips or take subsets of a longer video and give you clips from it. And people are claiming that you can string these together and, make a sort of living generating this sort of stuff. But nothing new here from a humanity perspective, of course. We've seen this sort of story of, oh, there's a new way to make money easy. I'm going to tell you how to do it. But I think with AI, it's pretty tempting to try and do it. And we are seeing examples of this on Amazon. And while I'm not a user of TikTok, I imagine this is already happening on TikTok as well. And one last story to round out this depressing section. The last one is a little bit older, but I figured we'd include it because of this theme. And the story is Twitter is becoming a ghost town of bots as AI-generated spam content floods the internet. This starts with a story from the marine scientist Terry Hughes and how when he opened X and searched for tweets about the Great Barrier Reef, which I guess he does often as a scientist in that area, he started seeing all these tweets that just are saying like random stuff like, wow, I had no idea the agricultural runoff could have such a devastating impact on the Great Barrier Reef. That came from a Twitter account, which otherwise just promoted cryptocurrencies. And there were several examples of these sorts of tweets that just are like, here's a random fact about this particular topic, and then otherwise they promote other stuff. So this is an example of people powering their bots to create like seemingly real content so that they could get some engagement and followers, and then could use those same Twitter accounts to promote, crypto coins or whatever you want. There you go. Another platform where people are pulling these sorts of tricks.
Yeah, they cite another sort of motivation for this is creating accounts with followings that can then be sold for whatever purpose, crypto being, I'm sure, one of them. It's sort of interesting. They do talk a fair bit about how bad this problem is generally on Twitter, and they give this example. I don't know if you guys remember, but back in the day, I think in the very earliest days, after I joined the podcast, we were talking about how there were a bunch of tweets. Like if you searched for the phrase, I'm sorry, but I cannot provide a response to your request as it goes against OpenAI's content policy. If you searched for that phrase in Twitter, you would actually find like a ton of these tweets, basically just giveaways that these bots were all kind of powered by ChatGPT because they'd been given a prompt in some instances that caused ChatGPT to say, no, I can't respond. And that generic response turned up in a whole bunch of just reams and reams of these tweets. So very clear that there is a big bot problem on Twitter. Elon's come on, and one of the changes that he's made is, of course, prevented people from accessing the Twitter API for free. So you now have to pay for it, which does raise the barrier to entry, but hard to know by how much. Anyway, so yeah, interesting story, a kind of a consequence of the times, really, and the fact that a lot of these LLMs, a lot of these systems, these agents are kind of naturally internet native. So the first place where you see their influence is, on Web 2.0 type websites like Twitter.
And to end things, we'll end on a slightly less depressing note. Once again, I just have one quick fun story to finish up with. And this one is man tries to steal driverless car in LA and doesn't get far. So this is about Vincent Maurice Jones, who got into a Waymo and tried to operate its controls and didn't get very far because nothing worked. Apparently, a Waymo employee just communicated with him via the car's communication system. And shortly after that, the representative also contacted the LAPD, and this person was arrested. So yeah, probably not a good idea to try and get into a self-driving car and take over it, because it is not meant to be driven by human, very explicitly.
They're very hard to threaten too.
Yeah, not, nice to end on a story that isn't part of a big negative trend. I don't think we'll see many people trying to steal self-driving cars. This is probably more of a one-off.
That's true. I mean, hopefully this makes carjackings less likely to happen. And if one place in the world can use that, it's California.
And with that, we are done with this episode of Last Week in AI. Once again, you can find our text newsletter with even more articles to know about everything that's happening in AI at lastweekin.ai. You can also get in touch. We have the emails in the episode description always, but I also mention them here. You can email contact@lastweekin.ai to reach me, or hello@glasstone.ai to reach Jeremy, or both. As always, we do appreciate it if you share the podcast or say nice words about us online, because that makes us feel nice. But more than anything, given we record this every week, it is nice to see that people do listen. So please do keep tuning in.